All right, welcome everybody. My name is Stella Windhagen. I'm from Europe, Scandinavia. I work as the director of the Resistance Studies Initiative here at UMass, which I think is an amazing initiative that exists because it's actually unique in the world with its focus on resistance and collaboration with what I would call the professors on the street, meaning the people that have hard-on experiences in blood and sweat and tears in learning of how to struggle for social change. Not just academics, but activists together with academics trying together to grapple with the question of resistance. So we've been going on since 2014, and every fall we have the Resistance Studies Speaker Series. I also want to mention some other part of our propaganda. So we have the International Peer-Reviewed Journal, which is unique in the world, 2 times a year, Journal of Resistance Studies, with book reviews where the editor is sitting here. And articles of different kind dealing with resistance of many different aspects. We have a thematic issue that is dealing with digital forms of resistance coming up in the fall. A couple of books over there. The presentation of the Resistance Studies Initiative also over there. Please spread to other people. And then we do have the speaker series. So we have an amazing group of people coming. It's going to be 4 presentations at least. This is what we know now. So Sean today, I'll come back to that. But after that we have Yunestra King talking about Barbara Deming's radical feminist nonviolence. She was one that was bridging between the black liberation struggle and the feminist struggle. Then we also have Mandy Carter coming 2 times. Mandy is an amazing activist coming from North Carolina. She's going to speak about why are intersectional resistance alliances so difficult to build? Examples from our LGBTQ+ movement. So it's going to deal with the question of why can't we collaborate more? There are good reasons why we can't, but we can find models. We can learn from experiences. That's what Mandy going to talk about. How we can find other ways of collaborating across different divides in a time like now in the US when basically everyone is being threatened by the present system. And then Mandy comes back in December. That's after we had a whole weekend workshop with 40 activists meeting up in Connecticut that comes from different groups, Muslims, black activists, queer activists, working class, to sit down and talk about our experiences of working across different divides and finding models of how to collaborate together. So basically, Mandy will, in October, talk about why it's so difficult. In December, give us our answers. Kind of. So, today, we have Sean Chabot coming from the West Coast, from Spokane, Washington State. We have been knowing each other since 20 years. We met at a conference in Finland the first time, and found out that we had an affinity for critical theory and resistance. So what you want to talk about today, I think you best present, but I want to underline that we are working on a project together which is about decolonizing resistance, trying to figure out perspectives of how to deal with the ongoing colonialization through resistance. So that's a coming book project. I'm really happy to have Sean here. I'm happy that you are here. And yes, we have a camera. So the camera is only taking pictures of me and Sean when he speaks. It will be turned off when we have discussions, so you don't have to feel that you're recorded, everyone. But that means we are putting it up on YouTube, and we try to do that with all our speaker series talks. So you can access them afterwards. So there's actually quite a wealth of talks up there already on the Resistance Studies YouTube channel. Yeah, I think that's it. Or, Debbie?
It'll be on the event page as well.
On the event page as well. Right, a link for that. Yeah, one more thing. There's a circulation of an attendance sheet. That's only if you want to get more information from us. It's over there right now. You can get mailings. We promise to only send things that are about resistance and resistance studies. We will not spam you with other things. And then for people that comes from my class, there's also an attendance here. Okay, so with that, Sean, very much welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks. So before I begin, who here has taken a class or participated in nonviolent resistance? Who feels, okay, quite a few, good. And so what I'm trying to do is to focus on how we tend to think and talk about nonviolent resistance when we see something in the news, in the media. And I want to show that often that way of talking about nonviolent resistance is presented as if it's the truth, as if it's the only way of thinking and talking about nonviolent resistance. So I want to show that there are actually also other ways of doing that. So that's really the main point. And I've been studying nonviolent resistance, I guess, close to 25 years, I guess. I'm getting old, so I lose a little bit of track of time. But in those years, in the beginning, I mostly studied Gandhi, and I studied how his ideas traveled to the US, especially to the US civil rights movement over many decades. But then as I was done with my PhD, I continued to look at and study nonviolent resistance. And as I was doing that, I realized that at least in the United States and also in Europe, the way that people talked about nonviolent resistance always seemed to be the same. So I would read case studies from all across the world, but if I looked at how how people talked about that nonviolent resistance, there was always kind of a fixed pattern. So usually, I think most of us, or most of you will be familiar with the fixed pattern. You have a mass campaign, people mobilize, people go on the streets, and if it works well, they stay there a while, they challenge an authority, and if everything goes well, they get media coverage, they stick together, they're disciplined, they have good leadership, they're united, then maybe they'll have a victory. Right? So it's usually a little bit like a football game. I don't know if there's a football game soon. It feels like it's between two teams, right? You have the nonviolent resistance team, and then you have sort of the opponent, right? The authorities. And so at some point, that's obviously true. I mean, we see it all the time. But I really felt like there was something missing here, and that there were also other ways of looking at nonviolent resistance. And actually, when I went back to what I'd read about Gandhi, when I read Gandhi, I don't read Gandhi is talking about nonviolent resistance in that way. Although whenever we see nonviolent resistance on TV, does anybody remember what happened in Egypt in 2011? The Egyptian revolution? Who remembers what happened in 2011? Okay, I don't know how long ago that is for people. But there, usually what happens, the first response is usually, oh, they're doing something like Gandhi. But that doesn't usually last very long. At least nowadays. Usually then they start talking about strategic nonviolent resistance, and then the name that almost always comes up is Gene Sharp, right? And so again, and then the story tends to be the same. So I wasn't really sure how to deal with it, how to say something about this until I saw the TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie. Who here has seen the TED Talk, The Danger of the Single Story? I think it's shown in many classes, right? So again, that's a good thing. So hopefully, if you've seen it, you'll know why it's pretty inspiring and pretty powerful, right? And I want to kind of pick up on that. So let's see. I'm not the best at PowerPoint. So just to show, I don't know how that shows up. Can you see it okay? Just to show, this is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. So she's a Nigerian novelist. I think one of the books, maybe people know other books, one of the books she's written is Americana, but there's several other books as well. And so the main point that she's making in that TED Talk is, and I don't want to, oops, I'm doing this. Let's see, the right one showing up? Okay, so obviously I don't want to go through the whole TED Talk, but basically how she starts is that when she was young in Nigeria, she would read children's books. And most of the authors in Nigeria is a British or was a British colony, so just to clarify that. Most of the authors that she read were actually British and sometimes also American, right? So all her characters were white, were blue-eyed, according to her, would talk about eating apples, would talk about the weather, right? Either about snow or about the sun, which is obviously very exciting in England. But then when she started writing herself, she was actually writing her stories in exactly the same way. So she started writing with characters that were white, that were blue-eyed, talked about the weather. Another thing she refers to, they all drank ginger beer. So hopefully you can already see how this is kind of ridiculous, right? If you're in Nigeria, there's no real point to talk about the weather. It's pretty much always sunny. And so her main point is that basically in her creating something, in the way that she thought about her stories and wanted to create something and wanted to do something with those thoughts, she was actually stuck within what she calls the single story, right? And so those single stories for her really defined her as an author, but also really defined her, also her society in many ways as well. And then what she described is that she didn't really become aware of this danger until she started reading other African authors. I'm bad at names. The guy who wrote The Things That Fall Apart, what's his name? Achebe, right? Achebe was one of them, and several other ones like that. So then all of a sudden the characters were not white, blue-eyed. Hopefully you get the point that she's trying to make. So stories have a lot of power, right? So stories have a lot of power to kind of define you and to kind of lock you in a certain way of thinking that's not really related to your context. But stories have also, I guess you could call it more of a resistance power, right? They can also empower you, right? They can also humanize you, and they can also, through stories, you can also deal with some of the issues or problems that you faced, and they can kind of repair your dignity, as she says, right? So just to make sure that I give credit to her words, here's a quote, sort of towards the end of her TED Talks. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess, sorry about the spelling there, and to malign. But stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity, right? So when I saw this and when I read this, this was my way to sort of open up the project about how to look at nonviolent resistance differently, right? So hopefully you get the logic of what I'm trying to do. On the one hand, I'm trying to say what is the single story, right, of nonviolent resistance, and what is kind of the danger of that, really following Adichie in that sense, or at least her way of thinking. And then the other part of the story, which she doesn't focus on quite as much, is on diversifying the stories, diversifying the concept of nonviolent resistance, and also how it's practiced with other stories, with what I'm calling counter stories, right? So counter stories are obviously challenging that single story and trying to tell the story about something in a different way, right? Let's see, who here has actually heard of Gene Sharp? Who has read some Gene Sharp? Wow, this is great. You're kind of confirming my hypothesis that Gene Sharp is the single story. But so anyway, I think most of you, or many of you, hopefully are familiar with his way of thinking, and it's fairly common sense. And this is also part of it, right? When something is common sense, when you don't really have to think about it much, that's when it becomes extra powerful, right? So I think with Gene Sharp, it's similar. So Gene Sharp's single story, I'll just focus on a few aspects of it. So anytime we watch unarmed protest in the media, so for instance, if we take Egypt in 2011, people show that in the media seems to be focusing on unarmed people. Maybe people remember them camping out in Tahrir Square. Sometimes the police and military would come, but they would mostly remain peaceful. Then usually the term nonviolent resistance, or kind of an equivalent term as civil resistance, will come up. And then as soon as that word comes up, almost inevitably, they'll briefly talk about Gandhi and then go to Sharp, right? So Sharp, if you look at the newspapers and the media, he would literally be called the prophet of nonviolence. He's the writer of the rule book, the author of the rule book of how to do nonviolence. So does anybody see a problem with this? He's an American sociologist living in Boston, right?
Yep.
Boston.
Well, he's dead now. But
yeah, he just passed away. Does anybody see a problem with an American sociologist in Boston being sort of seen as the prophet, as the one who writes a rule book for what happens in Egypt? Do you want to? What do you see as a problem?
Well, one, it's one story. It doesn't always happen this way. Two, it doesn't really seem like it's that directly involved with what's happening.
Exactly. What about? Did you have? Yeah. Did you have something, or you were?
I feel like it also like kind of perpetuates like white savior narrative too. He's like this old white dude who's like coming in and like saving all these like black and brown people from.
Exactly. And so just to be fair to him, this was not necessarily his intent, right? So he would say, he would definitely always say, hey, I didn't make them do that, right? But obviously, those interviews happen. And the more important point is that in our minds, this connection makes sense. So Gene Sharp is not really the problem, right? It's how we use that to think about something that's the problem, right? ADICHTE actually, in her TED Talk, she said she loved those children's stories. They opened up a whole new world to her, right? So the problem is not the authors or the books. The problem is that she could only think about how to write and how to think about something in that way. The same with Gene Sharp, right? Just to be clear on that. So again, my argument is, on the one hand, Gene Sharp's story clearly empowers a lot of activists. I don't know if anybody here has used it. A lot of activists use his work, right? It's very practical, very hands-on. You can do something with it almost right away. But my argument is that it also kind of breaks some kind of dignity, right? Kind of like what you said about the savior complex. It breaks dignity, as if people in Egypt can't sort of write their own story, right? And just to be, I don't want to go into it in too much detail, but there are other authors who kind of confirm that single story, right? So there's Peter Ackerman. He was a student of Sharp. He wrote a well-known and important book in the field on the what he called strategic nonviolent conflict, right? Where he says nonviolent resistance is like a lot of other kinds of strategic conflicts between corporations, between militaries, etc. And also he founded the International Center of Nonviolent Conflict, which really promotes nonviolent resistance in many different ways. They offer all kinds of online courses. People associated with it are often in the media. And probably the most well-known author in the field today is Erica Chenoweth. I think she was here like a year ago, 2 years ago.
Yeah, she's been here more than
several times. Yeah. So Chenoweth is probably the best known. She wrote the book with Maria Stephan, Why Civil Resistance Works. And so she basically proved one of the main things that Sharp is claimed, is that nonviolent resistance is basically more than twice as good a method as violent resistance, right? So Sharp pointed that out early on. They provide very overwhelming data to prove that, right? So they really strengthen that single story in very important ways. Just to give you an image of, he looks really dark. It's like Darth Vader or something. But anyway, it's a little bit hard to see maybe, but, and hopefully I can kind of come back to this. You see Gene Sharp's, do people see there's that image of Gandhi? right behind him. This is, I think we can realize it's probably not coincidence, right? But so there's a little bit of an implication, Gandhi and then Sharp kind of continuing that legacy, right? I think I saw a title somewhere, Sharp, the Gandhi of East Boston, right? So again, there's kind of an equivalence made that I want to kind of problematize or kind of think about a little bit later on. So if we go into a little bit more of what Sharp is actually saying, one of the things that Sharp said is that, and I'm using Stellan's way of thinking about nonviolence here, nonviolent resistance. So Stellan, didn't like this kind of, or doesn't like this binary, right? Violent, nonviolent, yes or no. It's a little bit too black and white, right? So instead of talking about nonviolence, it's more, how would I put it, more appropriate. It's easier to kind of look at it more carefully by focusing on against violence. So what is nonviolence against, right? And then also in what sense is it without violence? Or how does it try to be as much as possible without violence? So if we apply that way of thinking to Sharp, the basic idea is, again, there are two teams. You have the people who are without the violence, right? That's where they use the nonviolent methods. And then you have the violent regime, right? So hopefully it's clear. No real focus on the violence among the nonviolent people, for instance, right? It's very sort of two teams separated from each other. And then he wrote the handbook for this kind of nonviolent action that he thought, that's where he focuses on a strategic approach. I don't want to go into it in too much detail, but he basically defines for people using his approach how political power works. So again, the way he defines it is people allow a regime, allow a government to exist because they consent to it, right? Without the consent, there'd be no, the government wouldn't be able to manage. And so the first step for any nonviolent resistance is to withdraw that consent, right? So it's basically like a rational choice. If you don't like what you're getting, learn to withdraw consent. He's famous for providing 198 methods, a little bit like a cookbook with 198 recipes, basically. So that's important. And then the dynamics, he talks about how to prepare a campaign, how campaigns work in practice, how to build sort of a plan, a strategy, and then how to make sure, a little bit like a military, right? How, when you actually have an action, how that action fits with the strategy. Right? And then he has different pathways on how change happens, right? But again, the way he sees change is always connected to the resistors, the people, and the government. So change is always the government somehow changing something. So the government might give in to the demands. Sometimes the people completely take over the government, right? But change is always about what the government does in response to that movement, right? And hopefully I can show there are many other ways of thinking about change. Not that that's wrong, but there are many other ways. And another thing that's maybe one of the more controversial parts of my argument is, if you look carefully, his vision of change, his vision of freedom, of democracy, is very strongly influenced by a Western, you could even say American, view of liberal democracy, right? Political rights, civil liberties, I think we're all familiar with liberal democracy. And if you look even a little bit more carefully, basically implicit is that capitalism is pretty much normally and almost naturally a part of that, right? So again, winning means achieving or improving a system of capitalist liberal democracy, right? So most nonviolent resistance campaigns are against an undemocratic regime. Let's say Egypt is a good example. Mubarak, clearly undemocratic. You kick him out, and then the victory is, well, at least now you can be more democratic. If you look at Egypt today, it's probably not quite what happened, but that's another story. So basically, again, what I want to emphasize is the single story really affirms how we think in the West, especially about freedom and democracy. Let's see here. Probably the person, I know this is a long quote, but the person who pretty much sums up what I'm trying to say is Peter Ackerman, Sharp's student. And so he basically says there are all kinds of events happening all over the world throughout history, and they're all very different in terms of context, situation, who they're fighting. But at the end, he's saying it's all actually essentially the same story, right? He sees that as a strength, which obviously it is, and trying to persuade people, I'm trying to problematize. Maybe it's not such a good thing to always have the same story, right? So it's a story of what people do when their interest and those of their opponents cannot be reconciled. Again, those two teams, their interest, opponents, if those don't match, then that's where it comes from. When the normal political processes in functioning democracy is liberal democracy. Usually we can see capitalism as, or at least seen as part of that. And when armed resistance is an unpromising option, right? So for me, this kind of sums up how the single story kind of works. So what I want to show is that there are quite a few dangers of this single story. And I'll come back to this later, so I won't go into too much detail. Basically, Sharp underestimates the complexity of violence, right? There are many kinds of violence. There's very visible violence, so in a dictator it's very visible, but there are many other kinds of violence, right? Anybody think of any other kinds of violence besides just a dictator, putting people in prison, maybe death penalty, or cops maybe, I don't know, bashing somebody's head in? What other kinds of violence can we think of?
Threat of losing your job.
Losing your job? Okay.
Organize a union.
Okay. And so how can that be a form of violence, just losing your job? In what sense?
Well, depending on where you live, I mean, you could lose your house, you could lose your family.
Exactly.
Your ability to earn a living if you're blacklisted.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
So many ways it harms many different aspects, your dignity. Let's say if you have family, you can't pay for medicine, that your child might, let's say, perhaps die of a disease that normally with medicine that wouldn't have happened, something like that, right? So it has all kinds of effects. Any other examples of violence?
Intimate partner violence.
Okay, that's a good and very important example as well. So Gene Sharp does not go there, right? He does not go to intimate, partner violence and say, oh, this is how you need to do nonviolent resistance, right? That's not something that he necessarily is focusing on. I don't know, in the media, I don't think if they talk about intimate partner violence, I don't know if I've ever heard nonviolent resistance come up in that context, right?
You could also talk about, I guess you could say it's a kind of mental violence in the form of propaganda or other similar tactics like that.
Sure, yeah, so something that's kind of dehumanizing, where perhaps you feel like you're inferior, right? This is a huge part of colonialism, right? And obviously if you feel colonized, that's violence in almost every aspect of your way of life, right? So I think that's important. So that's kind of what I want to focus on. And then another aspect, again, just like ADICHTE, it's very hard once you believe in this single system and it has that kind of power to imagine any other kinds of stories besides that strategic nonviolent resistance story. And it's also, Sharp doesn't really pay much attention to how to get beyond capitalist violence, right? Or capitalist liberal democratic violence. For him, capitalism is part of the answer, not part of the problem, right? And so I want to say, hey, that's problematic. I think capitalism, I think we can see it now with environment and climate change and many other ways, is part of violence as well. So I want to bring that up. So again, to kind of connect it back to what ADICHTE says, I'm arguing that the single story can often break kind of the dignity of subaltern stories of nonviolent resistance, right? So the stories of people who are usually not heard, who are not on TV, who don't have much authority, right? So this is where the idea of counter stories comes in, right? So counter story, and by the way, this may be a little bit new, so if you have any questions or something seems unclear, feel free to interrupt me. That's fine. Obviously you can save it for later too, but feel free to interrupt me. So one of the things about counter stories, they challenge the single stories, and they also challenge what Michel Foucault, who's heard of Foucault here? okay? What Michel Foucault calls the regime of truth, right? I don't want to go into it. I could do a whole lecture on the regime of truth. But the basic idea of the regime of truth is when we consider something to be true, we think that it's been proven, let's say by a scientist or by some kind of expert. Yeah, this is just true, right? Foucault, what he's trying to point out, well, whatever we accept as true is not just true, it's made true, right? Because certain people with power say that will accept, that'll count, they'll function as true, while something else that might be very true to that other person doesn't count as true. Does that make sense? I know Foucault's a little bit tough there. So my main interest is in what the regime of truth does. What it really does is it covers up what Foucault also calls subjugated knowledges, right? So to subjugate is to kind of like push under, right? I guess you can imagine pushing it underground where you can't see or hear it. And so for me, the idea of counter stories is it's trying to bring those subjugated knowledges about nonviolent resistance, let's say nonviolent resistance in the case of intimate partner violence, for instance, right? And bring that up to the surface and say, hey, we can think and talk about nonviolent resistance in a different way. Again, I don't want to go into too much detail, but subjugated knowledge is usually hidden and also disqualified, right? So somebody might say something about nonviolent resistance, and it might make sense in some other context, but people decide this is irrelevant, right? We're not going to print it. We're not going to talk about it. It's not going to be sort of the authoritative, legitimate knowledge about that issue. And there's also something kind of a little unique about counter stories is it kind of brings up a different kind of a methodology, a different way of producing and then also creating knowledge, also expressing knowledge. So what that means is when you write about counter stories, you can be a little bit like a novelist. This is partly why I use ADICHTE too, right? You can be a novelist and you can use facts that actually happen, historical facts or historical events. And so you can be creative. You can, based on whatever facts, you can write about it in a way that's not as linear or as to be honest, bland most social science writing is, right? So you can be a little bit creative. And so that's, I think, one of the things that I also like about that idea. But it doesn't mean just because you're creative or you're using a little bit of the way of writing of fiction, it doesn't mean that you can't analyze what's happening, right? To me, I compare it a little bit to a film about an event. Sure, you can have documentaries where everything is factual, but I'm sure people have seen, what do they call them, like maybe like a biopic, right? Where it's, let's say Malcolm X, whatever reason came to mind, using the facts, but Spike Lee is trying to create a story with that, right? He's being creative, basing it on his autobiography, but also being creative in how it's presented. So I guess in a way, counter stories try to do something similar to that. So let's see. So there are two, maybe I'll move a step back here. There are two counter stories that I want to look at. One from the past, again, back to Gandhi. So basically, the counter story there is something that is very familiar, Gandhi. I'm arguing that actually whatever, what Gandhi really has to contribute is kind of lost by equating what Gandhi said with what Sharp said, right? So that's one way of subjugating Gandhi's perspective. And I'll focus on that briefly because the main thing I want to focus on, at least for today, since time goes very fast, is what I call the commoning form of nonviolent resistance, right? And I'll talk about what commoning means, but basically it means changing your way of life in your town, in your village, at all different levels, at home. So for instance, intimate partner violence is a major important aspect of that. Also in your community, and also learning to kind of govern yourself, right? Without having to rely on either the capitalist market or on the national state, whether it's democratic or not, right? So that's where I'm trying to go with this. So one of the first counter stories on Gandhi, and what I'm arguing is that whereas Sharp focuses on a strategic form of nonviolent resistance, Gandhi really focuses, if you read all his work, on what you could call a constructive form of nonviolent resistance, right? So everybody perhaps knows that he was for big campaigns, the Salt March. Probably most people have heard about the Salt March, right? But really those events that we know about and that are in the history books and that are dramatic are really a relatively small part of what Gandhi is trying to do, right? Basically the main part of what he's trying to do is he's trying to construct other ways of life. So you have a British colonialism, right? People from India are being colonized. They're starting to actually desire what their colonizer wants them. He sees this as a big problem, right? And then when people from India are becoming kind of like the British, then taking over the government is not really going to change things, right? The way of life will be the same even if there's a different person in charge. So he comes up with a metaphor on his thinking, and this is in an early book that he wrote, 1909. I think he wrote it in 08, but published 09. It's called Hind Swaraj. Hind is obviously Hindu or India. And then Swaraj basically means self-rule, home rule or self-rule, right? And so he writes that book as a dialogue. Actually, you could almost see it as a counter story, actually. He writes it as a dialogue between an imaginary reader, and that reader is representing kind of the consensual way of thinking about how India should gain independence, right, from the British, and then the editor. And the editor is, of course, implicitly Gandhi, right? And so the reader says to Gandhi, to the editor, no, we have to remove the British. There's no way we can be independent without removing the British, because a tiger is a tiger. Tigers don't change their nature, right? So you can't, you know, to really gain independence, you have to remove the tiger. And so this is what Gandhi, in my view, quite brilliantly says in return. He says, you've drawn the picture well. In effect, it means this, that we want English rule without the Englishman. You want the tiger's nature, but not the tiger. That is to say, you would make India English, and when it becomes English, it'll be called not Hindustan, but Englistan. This is not the Swaraj that I want. I'll give you a minute. What do people think? What does he mean with the tiger and the tiger's nature? What is he trying to say here? Anybody? So you want the tiger's nature, but not the tiger, right? Sure.
If you change the administration without changing the institution, then it doesn't really change anything.
Okay, okay. So that's important, right? So if you change, yeah, I mean, I think in American context that would kind of work, right? So, and then not only change the institution, but also change just your whole way of life, right? So change what happens in communities, not only in the government. Because the tiger's nature becomes a part of you. That's who you are, right? And so I think that's important. Any other thoughts? What is he trying to say? Why doesn't he like this idea of independence, of self-rule? Why does he see that as a problem? You kick out the government, the British government, victory, right? Everybody's celebrating. But Gandhi says, gee, be careful. Why, you know, don't celebrate too early, right? Why is that?
Well, I think it's because he sees people as being bound by the economic systems of the British.
Exactly.
The British themselves are bound by that.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
be unfree.
And exactly, so this is also what actually happened if you look at history, right? You decolonize, you're still dependent on your former colonizer. So really it's like, you know, some people talk about as neo-colonialism. So you could say Gandhi is afraid of neo-colonialism, right? But it goes also farther than just the economy, right? People haven't learned to be independent, right? They still want what the British had. They still want the same clothes. They want to listen to the same music. They want the same kind of jobs, right? For him, that's not independence, right? So I think that's one of the important things that Gandhi says that's quite different from Sharp, right? Can anybody try to connect this to, what would Sharp say about this? How is what Gandhi says about tiger and tiger's nature different from what Sharp said? What is Sharp's main point?
The tiger's the enemy, so therefore it has to be changed.
Exactly. Get rid of the tiger. That's it, right? Not really addressing the tiger's nature, right? So in a way, it's very similar to what Sharp is saying. So that's that's basically the point I want to make, is that if you look at Gandhi, his logic of how independence happened is really quite significantly different, right? If you look at an event, sure, you'll have, you know, a march, or there'll be some kind of a strike perhaps, or a boycott. Those kind of look the same on the surface, but when Gandhi talks about what it all means, it's quite different, right? Let's see. So, and then basically I'm arguing, and of course I can't do this very well here, not enough time, but in my book I'll try to argue that really everything he did since then, we should really see it in this context. Really what he's trying to do is transform the tiger's nature. That's his main purpose, right? So of course if the British regime does something that prevents people in India from addressing the tiger's nature on their own, undermining what happens in the community, sure, you try to resist to stop what they're doing. But by focusing on the government, that's not how you gain independence. You really get independence at home, in your community, in your way of life, right? And so he invented what he called the constructive program, and really that's kind of like community organizing. I'm assuming everybody knows what community organizing is. So it's really community organizing to change things. If there are conflicts between communities, you try to address that within the community. And the main thing that I want to point out is that for him, he actually wrote a book on the constructive program, and he had a list of 18 aspects of that program. Way at the bottom did he put what he called civil resistance, basically strategic nonviolent resistance. So in his view, in theory, this would not be necessary even to do strategic nonviolent resistance, although in practice, usually you would have to, right? But he clearly put it on the back burner. So again, the purpose is personal and political self-rule. So again, very different from Sharp. He's obviously not trying to win by bringing in Western civilization. That's the tiger's nature. No, he wants to transform the tiger's nature. He wants to transform Western civilization, capitalism, liberal democracy. Again, very different from Sharp. And so his vision is really more of a post-capitalist federation of autonomous villages, right? Really bottom up. So the grassroots is really where, for him, independence and freedom and democracy should happen. And then they can link up with each other, but that's really the focus in how to think about freedom. Let's see, any questions about this? Okay, so now, I know I kind of waited a long time. Now I come to what I hopefully we can see as kind of the main contribution that I'm trying to make, is to combine this idea of the commons and commoning and bring it into the field of nonviolent resistance. Who's heard of the phrase reclaiming the commons? Okay, so quite a few. Actually, I think there's some famous people, maybe even at Amherst. Anybody heard of David Bollier? Anybody? Nobody here? I think he's even in Amherst. So there's several well-known people. So my point is, look, there's all this stuff that's really exciting about commons and commoning. Nobody brings it into the field of nonviolent resistance. And when you read about commons and commoning, you don't see much about nonviolent resistance. My point is, no, we need to bring those together, right? Again, I can't go into too much detail. Commons basically means that within a certain space, you share a resource. Let's say water, right? So let's say there's water here. Let's see, does anybody have a bottled water? Bottle of water. So water, it can be something common. Let's say that we sort of organize and we sort of decide how to distribute it, and we work together to make sure the water is good, right? But often water becomes either something that's owned by corporations, right? If you have a bottled water, that's corporate. But even the water from the faucet is basically, you could say that the state is involved, right? The state decides, where it comes from and everything else. So the commons, the most important thing to remember is it tries to minimize how much we depend on capitalism and also how much we depend on the national state, right? Commoning is really more the act of sort of maintaining and promoting and expanding the commons. And so again, to sustain some other way of life. And what I'm trying to argue is that the Zapatistas are a good example of a commoning movement. And again, the Zapatistas is significant for me because in the field of nonviolent resistance, very, very few people will count the Zapatistas as a form of nonviolent resistance. Who's studied the Zapatistas? Do people know how they started? How did they start? Oh yeah, anybody, it doesn't really matter.
Well, I mean, they were indigenous people from Chiapas, southern Mexico.
Yeah.
And their uprising, as far as I know, wasn't violent. They had guns, but they weren't loaded.
Okay, so that's at some point. Anybody, is that how it started? Anybody have any other information, other thoughts? Actually, that was soon, right? But in the beginning, they were definitely armed struggle.
Yeah.
They took over local governments, right? They had rifles, and of course, a lot of them got shot. Also, people from the Mexican military got shot. But then you're right. Very soon after, I think within 2 weeks, they said we're going to silence our rifles, right? So we're going to put it down. So my point is that if I'm a nonviolent resistance scholar, and I believe in the single story, I've seen those rifles. You can't be a nonviolent resistance movement anymore. I'm saying, okay, well, that's true, and it's perhaps problematic. We could think about it, but let's look at what they've done since then. And I want to argue that a lot of what they've done since then, is really important for thinking about nonviolent resistance, right? And also, they also think where Stellan focuses primarily on against and without violence. I want to argue this idea of beyond violence, right? So for something to be non-violent in a more transformative, perhaps revolutionary way, we should look at, what is it against? How does it minimize the violence that it uses? But also, what is the effect on the people? How does it transform their lives, right? How does it transform their relationships? How does it transform their communities? So those three, I've kind of made it three-dimensional in that sense, right? Let's see. So, just to give you some ideas of how the Zapatistas are commoning, so when, you mentioned about them, when they took over the land, right, through the armed struggle partially, they not only beat, in many ways, or in many cases, the Mexican military, but they also occupied land, right? And once they had that land, they started reclaiming it. They said, we're going to use our old way of life, indigenous way of life, and we're going to use that to occupy the land and to produce a new way of life on that land, right? So obviously, cooperation was very important for them, a crucial aspect of commoning. So for them, as the nonviolent resistance is as much about schools, about health clinics, about economic cooperatives as it is about struggles against, for instance, the military, right? They govern themselves. They're, I would argue, the most, maybe the largest self-governing, perhaps, area in the world. I'm not, maybe that's a bit grandiose, but they have a huge area, and if it's a Zapatista municipality, they basically govern it, right? And obviously, there's also military, so the military obviously is also watching them, but for the most part, they make their own decisions. And also, the ethics of how they live is obviously also crucial, right? So one of the things that they do that's obviously very different than most ways of thinking about democracies, they govern not by representing or telling people this is what needs to be done. No, they govern by obeying, right? Anybody? I don't know, maybe I'm making it too long. What do people think, what do you think they mean when they say they want to govern by obeying? What do you think they mean?
Not sure, but could it be reaching some kind of consensus and then people organically follow it?
Somewhat, right? So the following part is oh, go ahead.
Yeah, they don't govern, the people govern. They tell them what to do, and the government listens to the people.
Exactly. If I'm a leader and I don't know what the people I'm representing want, I go to the people. What do you guys want? Do you see what I mean? So I don't go to the government and say, this is what my people want. If I say, hey, people, what do you want? So you consult the people all the time. Does that make sense?
To clarify, when you say govern by obeying, the implicit subject is the government governs by obeying the people, right?
No, well, it's a play on words, but the Zapatista leaders are governing in their own autonomous communities by obeying the people. They don't govern for themselves. They don't want to try to get elected in some fancy national election. They want to serve the people, right? And another aspect is this ethics of asking we walk. So for them, change is not something that happens in one big revolution. It's something that you're constantly walking towards, right? And you're always questioning what you're doing. You're not assuming that you know what needs to happen. And so their vision is really making a world in which many worlds fit, right? So what for them, difference is absolutely crucial, right? So as indigenous, they've been left out of mostly Mexican mainstream society, so they know how important it is to maintain that difference. But they also want to cooperate and collaborate, let's say, with LGBT people, let's say, in Amherst, right? For them, we're all kind of fighting the same struggle, and we're all different, but we all kind of want to make a different world where these worlds can actually fit rather than being exploited and being sort of forced to be consumers, et cetera, right? So hopefully that image is clear. And so what I want to do is I want to read actually the counter story, because it's a little bit, I don't want to summarize the counter story. The whole point of what I'm trying to do is I want us to kind of listen, and sometimes it might take a little bit more patience than usual, to what the Zapatistas, and especially the Zapatista women, are actually saying about how they respond to violence and how they are practicing forms of nonviolent resistance, right? But just to give you a few images, and I'll refer to these in my counter story, and this is one of my favorite signs. Before you enter any village, it says here, the people govern and the government obeys. That's closer to what you're saying, right? So again, I'll refer to that in a minute. This is a picture of Zapatista women who are often on the front line, right? Usually we say go on the back line or the back of the attack, but they're actually on the front line. They're actually the most militant, even aggressive, right? Some might say violent, right? They're shoving, they sometimes have sticks, they sometimes throw rocks, etc. And then here, of course, really important for them, they're cooperatives, right? Obviously, if we want to be post-capitalist, you have to produce you have to become self-sufficient in a different way. So when I read the counter story, and actually I need to grab it. When I read the counter story, I just want to make clear that I'm basing it on an ethnography. The ethnography is by Hilary Klein, is the author, and she wrote a book on Zapatista women. It's called Companyeras, and also other sources, about the Zapatistas and the Zapatista women. So the way I'm doing it, trying to be creative, I don't know if I totally fail. I'm still a social scientist, but I'm trying to imagine. The way I write is I'm trying to imagine that I'm an ethnographer visiting a Zapatista community and talking to Zapatista women about their experiences and trying to focus primarily on what the women say, right? So I'm not trying to focus on what I say as much there. And also, focus on how commoning, what kind of nonviolence it's trying to practice. So it's a kind of nonviolence that goes against, without, and beyond violence. And also nonviolent resistance at home, actually intimate partner violence is just as important as the nonviolence against the military, and also in work, right? Trying to make work an important part of that nonviolent resistance, right? So as I read it, try to think about what you learn from that counter story, and also perhaps how it allows you to think about this a little bit differently than we normally do. So I wish I were a better actor. So finally, after years of admiring and studying the Zapatistas as an American sociologist, I've arrived at one of their autonomous municipalities. I recognize the sign as I enter the village. And even though I can't read Spanish, I know it says, "Here the people govern and the governors obey." I get settled and spend the night in the building for visitors. The next day, I set out with the translator to visit and talk to a small group of Zapatista women, or compañeras, as they call themselves, about their struggles to confront violent social conditions and make less violent worlds possible. My first question asked the compañeras for their thoughts on violence in their personal lives and what they've done to address it. Maria, an older woman, reluctantly speaks up and shares how indigenous women in her village used to be forced to give birth to many children, while indigenous men internalized the oppressive mentalities of their non-indigenous bosses and dominated their wives and daughters at home. Then she adds, and these are her words, "My husband used to get drunk a lot. He didn't hit me, but he spent all our money. He would go find work, but then he came back without any money. I had to work, raise chickens, sheep, and pigs because I needed money to take care of the family." We joined the struggle before 1994. The first authorities in the organization counseled us, talked to us about this path. Women have the right to participate now. We're not as timid. Women also have the right to go out and see new places. When we're in our village all the time, we can never learn anything new and nothing changes. Before, my husband didn't give me permission to leave the home. In 1994, he began to change, and he's changed little by little. Now the men also stay at home and take care of the children when the women have somewhere to go. Other women who are not in the organization, they haven't experienced these changes. They're still suffering and nothing has changed for them. That makes us very sad. When I wonder about the reasons for these domestic changes, several women point to the women's revolutionary law adopted in 1993, right before the Zapatistas actually started their uprising. I learned that the late Comandante Ramona and Comandante Susana spent several months traveling to all the Zapatista communities to hold assemblies and listen to women's concerns before drafting the Women's Revolutionary Law's 10 principles. These principles not only articulate their rights and duties in relation to political participation, economic self-sufficiency, and basic needs like education and healthcare, but also their rights and duties in selecting their own marriage partners and seeking protection from abuse by the men in their lives. Next, I asked the compañeras to discuss their responses to state violence in Chiapas. They tell me how in 1998, local women organized to confront the Mexican army and defend their villages, using their bodies, sticks, and stones to block, intimidate, and push back the soldiers, while expressing their rage with insults and chants. They mention a famous picture of a small unarmed indigenous woman grabbing a heavily armed soldier who looked shocked and startled by her physical aggression. I remember seeing the photo, and I'm curious to hear what it means to them. They say that the decision for militant action against the military emerged from a meeting of Zapatista women and were approved by each Zapatista community. They insist that these brave acts of violent resistance did not kill anyone and helped minimize the violence committed by the Mexican military. And Celeste, whose husband was killed by a Mexican soldier, describes the effects these acts had on other compañeros, right? These are her words. "We spoke up, we organized against the soldiers. The women found the courage to defend themselves in our communities. After that, women started to participate in other ways too, because we felt stronger." Following up on Celeste's comment, I asked them how they've addressed the violence of poverty that inspired the Zapatistas to start organizing in 1983 and rise up in 1994. The compañeras enthusiastically depict how forming women's cooperatives has been key to gaining communal self-sufficiency and human dignity in the face of economic violence. And in their own words here, "We began by organizing a vegetable garden. We chose our coordinators and then we had to get seeds. It was difficult because we weren't used to doing this kind of work, but that's why we feel strong now. We felt good when we were able to do it. At the beginning, people gossiped about us and criticized us. Now things are much better. We began to organize, to have women's assemblies, and to work in cooperatives. So basically my project, I'm trying to use these kind of counter stories to show you know, different forms, different stories of nonviolent resistance, and commenting, you know, there are different examples. I want to look at the shack dwellers in South Africa. I want to look at prison abolitionists in the US. And I don't want to try to put all those movements or their counter stories into the same theoretical or academic framework. I want to actually focus on their differences, right? But if there's one thing in common that they have, it's perhaps that idea of, what did you say, carving
out a space for themselves.
Yeah, carving out a space for themselves, right? So the difference is actually what's really important, because the for themselves is what really matters, right? So maybe just as a last thought, basically, and I'll kind of keep it short here, I'm trying to use the image of a mosaic to think about the importance of these counter stories, right? So when we talked about Gene Sharp, what I'm arguing, and if you look at his books and his framework, it's like a puzzle, right? All the puzzles fit, right? And the fact that the puzzles fit makes it easy to do, because it's all very clear, right? But again, it's also a single story. It's also limited, it's one-dimensional. If you look at a puzzle, the picture's already given to you, the pieces have already been carved out for you. Your only task is just to put the pieces together, right? And also, after you put the pieces together, it's not like you've created a work of art, right? You've just finished the puzzle, right? So what I want to use as another metaphor is the idea of a mosaic, right? And I particularly like the idea of a mosaic of broken glass, right? Again, that broken dignity that ADICHTE talked about. What I'm sort of imagining is that each counter story is like broken glass. It's like a story of broken dignity. And then if you put them together and see how they struggle against it, out of that broken glass or dignity can come something beautiful, right? But also, there are many ways to look at this, right? There's not just one way. A puzzle, there's one way, basically. It's one-dimensional, one way to look at it. A mosaic, you can look at many different parts. One, you know, if the sun is on it, it'll look like this. If it's in the, you know, less sun, it'll look differently. And so I like that image in terms of trying to, you know, increase the number of counter stories and show different ways of thinking about nonviolent resistance. So I'm sorry I kept you so long, but
thank you so much.
Yeah.